Welcome to BioTrack Training. In this module we're going to have a look at the HACCP menu. Now the whole subject of HACCP is too large a subject to cover in this module, and we're going to assume that you understand how the HACCP procedure works and how you define your HACCP. It's now an essential part of food hygiene throughout the world. In fact, it's an international standard of food hygiene and control. We'll assume that you understand how it works, and we'll look at some of the definitions that you can build here and how you can actually create your HACCP plan. First one we'll look at the HACCP teams. An HACCP team is your team of responsible people within your organization. It defines who's responsible for what aspect of HACCP, and in this case we can look, for example, at the audit of quality control. Cleaning and hygiene has a particular person responsible for it. It's important that an individual or a company or an external party like a food safety laboratory or a certifying authority is given responsibility for each aspect of hygiene, food safety. So we can define members of their HACCP team. As you can see here, there's a place for a signature and a place to browse for a scanned version of a signature that allows you to add these signatures to any documents for which this person or organization is responsible. And that's the HACCP team. Going back to the HACCP menu, there are process definitions. It's an essential part of HACCP that you define your production processes and the steps within those production processes, and here you can define the processes. A process is defined at a level, for example, like make jam from fresh soft fruit. It's a very high level, and here you can define those processes, and you'll see in a second how to define the steps within the process. We take process steps. Here's a process. Collect, check and pack eggs for retail and wholesale delivery, and within that process you have multiple process steps. The process step ID here indicates the order in which these processes occur. You can define any number of processes. The best advice is to keep processes very simple and comprehensive and logical. If you have too many process steps, you'll find that you end up with a very complex HACCP, more complex than it needs to be. So define logical steps in your process, and you do that here. The next thing is to define hazards. So here we've defined some hazards. For example, for jam production, one of the hazards, which is a biological hazard, is E. coli. Another one, salmonella. We've only defined a few here. There will be more, it depends entirely on your own business. In milk production in a dairy farm, for example, you're going to have things like fecal contamination from soiled animals. You're going to have bacterial contamination from poor milking practices, soiled equipment and hands, failure to clean and disinfect. You're going to have biological contamination from biological contaminants from the animal, mastitis. You're going to have, for example, you're going to have other biological contaminants caused by poor hygiene. You're going to have hazards caused by chemical contamination of any veterinary products. In an organic farm you shouldn't, but it could well be that you use cleaning chemicals, and these could provide a source of chemical contamination of milk. And you could have physical chemicals like physical contamination like dust, dirt, bedding material, dung, insects, animal hair. All of these are physical contaminants. But anyway, it's very specific to the kind of farm you're running and the kind of business you're running when you define the hazards. But this is where you define a hazard, and within that you define whether it's biological, physical or chemical, whether it's a high severity. In other words, if it's a serious hazard that is possibly life-threatening or health-threatening, or whether it's a not so serious hazard which is just maybe aesthetically undesirable. but nonetheless you define the severity there, and you also define the limit that's tolerable, which can be anything from 0 to whatever. You have to set in a numeric or subjective limit for a particular hazard, and then a full description of the hazard here. You can put in a very comprehensive description of the hazard, and that's how you define hazards. Going back then is the main part of HACCP, just where you define how a particular process step may be open to particular hazards. So here, for example, we have the process of collecting, chilling and storing milk. Step 1, which is to collect, chill and store the milk from the milking parlours. And the hazard that we're worried about here is fecal contamination from teats, udders, tails, etc. It's a medium risk hazard because it's quite a high possibility that this is going to happen. This process step is a critical point. It's a point at which you should check for this hazard, and you justify your decision for making it a critical point by saying that the point of milking is a high risk source of fecal contamination, which it obviously is, and you then provide the preventative measures such as udders should be disinfected, normal milking parlour hygiene, and the animals are cleaned before entering the milking parlour. And so you've defined a process step hazard and a critical point. Once you've defined all of these hazards and critical points and process steps, you need to define the plans for managing them. And here we have a plan. The critical point is what we just looked at. Milk is pumped from bulk storage. This is another critical point. Milk is pumped from bulk storage to a tanker twice daily. Critical limit for this action is 0. What we're looking for is visible contamination. We monitor it visually. The person who is responsible for monitoring it is this guy who's in charge of hygiene. We monitor every batch. The action, if we see contamination, is to stop pumping and clean the milk lines. And we verify it by checking 1 out of every 100 litres of milk pumped from the storage tank, and we keep the records in the QA registry. And that's our plan basically for dealing with this hazard in this process step. Now we need to define a plan for every hazard in every process at every critical point in all process steps. So the designing of an HACCP is a very large piece of work, and it takes a lot of consideration. So that's basically HACCP. We would advise that you keep the number of hazards, the number of process steps, and the number of critical points you define to an absolute minimum. Not less than you need, but not more than you need. Otherwise you will end up with a very, very, very large HACCP plan, and that's going to make your life more complicated. We'll be giving you a bit more advice about HACCP in other modules, but that's it for now. Thank you.